Hello everyone, so welcome to your math teacher with me, Mr. Fernando. In this video I'm going to be showing you how to do factoring by grouping. So in this case, notice that it's a bit more complicated. We have 4 terms, for example, and it's not so easy to factor out. And you're going to see that there's going to be some times where you may even have to move the terms around. So just because it's written in a particular order doesn't mean that you cannot move the terms around in order to be performing factor by grouping. So let's start by looking at example number 1, where it asks us to factor the following completely. So if you recall a previous strategy for factoring by grouping, you want to first look at the variables. So the first 2 terms, what we see, there's an x squared and an x there. So what do they have in common? They have x, and we always take the lowest power of the variable that's in common. So we're just going to focus on 2 terms at a time. So on those 2 terms, they have x in common. So then in order to get out the factors, we do x squared divided by x. So that gives us x. For the second term, we do xb divided by x, which will just give us b. If you recall from before, a quick way to check is if you imagine expanding it out. So if you do x times x, well, that gives us x squared, so that means it's correct. Then we try out x times b, well, that's just xb, so then that means that that will also be correct. Okay, so let's continue on. So now we're going to be looking at the next 2 terms, and we want to see what they have in common. So the last 2 terms, they have in common c as a common factor. Factoring out the c, we want to figure out what's going to be inside the brackets. So we do xc divided by c will just be x. bc divided by c will just be b. Good. And you could perform a quick check, but in this one it's pretty clear, so we're just going to continue on. Now the question we're asking us to factor completely, so we still need to see if we can factor it further. Notice that we are to look inside the brackets, we have x and b as common terms, so those are the common factors between the new 2 terms that we have. So we apply the previous technique that we found by grouping, factoring out x plus b. So looking at the first term, what do we need to have inside the brackets? Will be x. Looking at the second term, we need inside the bracket will just be c. So that's how you can factor out completely. Please feel free to press pause now and try out the rest of the questions you see on the screen, and then if you get stuck, check your solutions. Okay, thank you. Okay, so if you needed a little bit more help, so I'm going to try to show you how to work out the rest of them, okay? But make sure you at least attempted them on your own, and you could always download the worksheet so you could work with us together, okay? Given that this is just the introductory lesson, usually the terms are written in order for you to do the factoring. So here we're going to see the first 2 terms. What do they have in common? Just an a. Then we perform factoring. A times what will give us a squared? A. A times what will give us negative ab? Negative b. Then we focus our attention on the next 2 terms, negative ac and bc. What's in common between these 2? C. And let's open up our brackets. C times what will give us negative AC, negative A. C times what will give us BC, B. And if you don't want to think about multiplication, like I've shown in the previous example, think of division. So in other words, we want to get BC, we factor out the C. How do we get it back? BC divided by C will just be B. The question was asking us to factor fully, so now we want to check A. Can we factor this even further? last time we looked inside the brackets, so we had a minus b, but notice here we have negative a plus b. That means that we need to do something else before we have those two to be almost identical, so that way they can be common factors. So on the side you can think about negative a plus b, and if we're going to factor out a negative one, that will give us a negative b. How do we perform a quick check? Just expand it out, right? If we expand it out, that'll give us negative a plus b. So we're correct. So we're doing this trick because we want to factor fully, and we notice that the bracket terms, they can be written to be the same if we were to factor out the negative out. So let's rewrite this expression. Great. Now we can take a look at the bracket terms and notice that they are the same. So we can apply factoring by taking a minus b as the common factor between our two terms. Then inside the brackets will be a minus b times a divided by a minus b. In other words, a minus b divided by the common factor, which was a minus b, will just give us back a. And if you follow the same thinking, this should be negative c. So now we fully factored it. Let's try the two last examples. Oh no, there's three. Okay. Alright, so looking at this, normally we look at the first two terms, right? But notice they have nothing in common. But the two terms in the middle, they have a in common. And the first term and the last term, they have x in common. So this is the type of question that requires us to rearrange our equations. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to try to put them beside each other so it becomes a lot easier to visualize. So I'm going to rewrite this as x squared minus 5x plus 5a minus ax. So I'm doing this so I can factor by grouping, and I'm going to consider two terms at a time, and this way it's clear that I can group together the variable x in the first two terms. So factoring out the x, I'm going to get inside the brackets x minus 5 plus, what do the next two terms have in common? Just the a. So a 5 minus x. If we look at it inside the brackets, notice that they're not the same, but we can do the same technique that we used before, where we can rewrite 5 minus x. By factoring out the negative, we can rewrite this as negative 5 plus x. Or in other words, x minus 5 inside the brackets. So let's rewrite what that looks like now. Now we factor the negative x minus 5. Great, so we did this so we can perform factoring by grouping, and now the terms inside the brackets are identical, so we can factor them out as the common factor. X minus 5. What are we left over? It's going to be x minus a. So that's how you fully factor out that question. And again, not all the questions are going to be written in order, so you have to sometimes look at it and rearrange them so you can apply the factoring method by grouping. So I think there are two more examples, so let's try to see if we can do the next two, okay? Wow. Now there's so many terms. Let's see if they were nice enough to us and then they gave it to us in order. Looking at the first two terms, what do they have in common? Y squared. Okay, that's pretty good. Looking at the next two terms, what do they have in common? p squared. Okay, that's friendly. And the last two terms, what do they have in common? D. Let's see if this is going to work out. If it doesn't, we may have to rearrange and try a different order. But it looks like it might work out because we're considering two terms at a time to do factoring by grouping. So looking at the first two terms, we said y squared was in common, so we factor it out. What are we left inside the brackets? X plus 2. Plus, from the third and fourth term, they have p squared in common, so we factor out p squared, so we're left with x plus 2. And the last two terms, they have d in common, so we factor out d, and we're left with x plus 2. Wow, okay, that was somewhat difficult. Then looking inside the brackets, notice that each of them are actually the same. So we can apply the same technique as before to do factoring by grouping. So they have x plus 2 in common in all three terms. So we factor it out on the left. And what are we left inside the bracket? Y squared plus p squared plus d. And that's how you fully factor out this question. We cannot go any further. So it looks like we were correct in getting it in order. Lucky for us. And the last question in this video, question E. Let's see if they were nice enough to write it in order for us. So looking at the first two terms, what do they have in common? Well, they have x in common, but the greatest common factor, you also need to consider the variables. Not the variables, I mean the coefficients. So we need to consider 5 and 10. And what are the multiples of 10? 5 times 2. So what is the greatest common factor between 5 and 10? That would be 5. So now we have a slightly more challenging example because we need to common factor the variable with the lowest power, which was x, but also looking at the coefficients. The greatest common factor between 5 and 10 is 5. So we factor out 5x. 5x squared divided by 5x will just be x. Negative 10x divided by 5x, negative 2. Alright, so we focused so much on two terms that we forgot about the next two, right? So let's try to see what we can do. What is the greatest common factor between 3 and 6? Well, 3 is a prime number, so we cannot reduce it, but 6 can be written as 3 times 2, thus making the greatest common term 3. We're going to factor out the greatest common factor, which is 3. So that will give us inside the brackets x minus 2. That's great because now what's inside the brackets are the same, so we can further factorize. X minus 2 bracket 5x plus 3. Great. So in this part of the video, I show you how to factor when you have more than two terms. You do factoring by grouping, by considering two at a time. Sometimes you may need to rearrange the equation. And even when there's more than two terms, that could be 4 or 6, we apply the same techniques that we learned before. In the next video, I'm going to be showing you a couple of applications of how we can use this in the real world, or at least in the mathematical real world. Thank you for watching, and please subscribe.